Well, that was good. Thank you, Scott. Good morning, church.
Morning.
Morning.
Let's pray. Father God, thank you for your incredible love for us, and for your guidance in all things, Lord. Father, as we come before you today, I ask that you clear our hearts and minds of anything that is distracting us from your message. Open our hearts, Lord, to be filled by you, our minds to be filled with your words, with your Spirit. Father, I pray that as we talk this morning, we look at your word and look at the life of Job, Lord, that the truth will go beyond the words. That my voice will really not be a factor. That it'll be only you teaching us, Lord. Me too. Help us just to see what you have for us today, God. May your Holy Spirit be the guide. Father, we love you. We thank you that no matter what, you are always there for us. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. You know, that video was short, just brief ideas there. But it points out a very important truth, that there is hope in the darkness, and sometimes we don't see that. Sometimes we have absolutely no glimmer of hope when the darkness is around us, when it's crushing us. Sometimes we're really in too much pain to see or even to seek any kind of hope. But we must learn to choose that. Choose to seek. To choose to look for hope in the darkness. The fairly famous pastor, Chuck Swindoll, when he was first started his ministry, he met a guy by the name of Worrell. Now, Worrell had a unique background. At age 15, anybody 15 in here? Around that? Or a little bit more, some of you. Some of us a little more. Okay, then recall when you were 15, or look forward to when you might be 15. 15 years old, the doctors diagnosed him with rheumatoid arthritis. By the time he was 35 years later, or 30 years later, I'm sorry, 30 years later, I can't remember that. 30 years later, the rheumatoid arthritis had gotten to the point with other complications that he was totally paralyzed, except for one finger. He was completely blind, and he could barely speak. And with that one finger, he had a little string that attached to a recorder so that people could hear him talk. You think, man, what's the point of living? I mean, this is terrible. And yet, interestingly enough, as he's sharing the story with Swindoll, when he first contracted the disease in the early stages, he began to pray. He said, Lord, please heal me. But when that did not happen, instead he changed his focus. And this is what he said. He says, well, Lord, if this is the size plot in life you've staked out for me, let's you and me together show the world what we can grow. And through this tragedy, Worrell was able to somehow write several articles for National Magazine. He authored several books, and he became an inspiration to lots and lots and lots of people. But you know what is really intriguing? Is that in all of this darkness, Worrell was happy. He was happy. Because God was still there. God was still using him. God was still alive. And despite his misery, he had hope in the darkness. Our memory verse is 2 Timothy 1:12. And Paul is talking, he's saying, and he's responding to the fact of, in his sharing of the gospel, in the context of sharing of the gospel, he says, well, that is why I'm suffering as I am. Yet this is no cause for shame, because I know whom I believe. I'm convinced he's able to guard what I've entrusted to him until that day. Paul has been going through some tremendously hard times, and yet he's saying, yet I can trust. Yet, despite this suffering, it's no cause for shame. It's no cause for shame because I know whom I have believed in. Persuaded that he is able to keep that which I have committed unto him against that day. The thing is that we may not always know why we're suffering. We may not always have that comfort. Paul was able to have that comfort, but we may not always know. And we may wonder, why is this happening to me? Why is this happening to my friends? Why are they going through these things, Lord? I don't get it. And when that happens, we have to learn to trust God. We have to learn that even in the darkness, even in the despair, when a calamity strikes and everything is happening, we need to still trust God. And realize that he knows what he's doing, even if we don't. Yet when calamity strikes and despair sets in, it can be easy to fail to look for the light at the end of the tunnel. When we're in so much pain, when we are in so much distress, it's really easy to concentrate on the pain and the stress and not see that somewhere in the future there's hope. And that God provides that. Instead, we often mount our own defense. We try to find relief against the darkness, not by turning to the one who can really relieve it, but instead relying on ourselves. Building up our own walls against it. Trying to use our own devices to somehow combat that pain and darkness in our lives. And one way we do this is we live in our past comforts. We live in our past comforts. Common symptom of those who are mentally ill, who have gone through some kind of mental trauma, is a regression to the past. Going back and reliving happier times. It's a defense mechanism against the current pain. And so the brain takes you back to a time when you were happier, when you were safe, when things weren't happening to you like this. Job has been living his life behind a hedge of God's protection. And now the tragedy has come. Now the unbelievable pain has come into his life. He goes back there. He starts to live back in the past because that's where he thrived. That's where things were comfortable for him. And so he begins to relive it. And he starts out, though, by recalling his closeness with God. Look at Job 29, 2-6. He says, how I longed for the months gone by, for the days when God watched over me, when His lamp shone on my head, and by His light I walked through darkness. Oh, for the days when I was in my prime, when God's intimate friendship blessed my house, when the Almighty was still with me and my children were around me, when my path was drenched with cream and the rock poured out from me streams of olive oil. It's a time that he can look back and say, this was the good life. This was when life was comfortable. But Job has had it all. He's had wealth. He's had status. He's had family. He's had friends. But you know what's admirable here? The thing that he recalls first and foremost is his relationship with God. If you were to lose everything, if everything was falling down around you, what would you relive first? In Job's case, it's God. Job, the intimacy that he's had with God is so extreme, is so wonderful, is so powerful that that's the first thing he turns to for comfort. I have to wonder if we would. The thing is if you've never experienced that in your Christian life, if you've never experienced that intimacy with God, you don't know what you're missing. An intimate relationship with God, not just head knowledge, not just I'm growing in God, I've learned about Him, but to really develop through contemplation, through prayer, through spending time with Him, an intimacy with God. Once you get that, there is nothing else that compares. There is no joy in life. There's no companionship. There's no the feelings that you get when you're in love. They're great. Don't get me wrong. It's nothing compared to the intimacy you have with God. You know why is that? Why is that? Why should we really have that feeling over everything else that we experience in life? And I think the reason is because we were made by and we were made for God. God designed us for that. He designed us for that relationship. He designed us for that intimacy. And that ultimately, no matter if we lose our family, if we lose our friends, we lose our possessions or anything else, that ultimately is fulfilling. Our relationship with God is the ultimate thing to strive for, because that's what we were designed for. The thing is, though, but in our despair oftentimes, there are other things from our past that often used to comfort us that we cling to as well. Especially if we've never had that intimacy with God. Job, even though he's had that intimacy, he remembers other things as well that comforted him. Job 29, 7 through 11. He says, when I went to the gate of the city and took my seat in the public square, the young men saw me and stepped aside, and the old men rose to their feet. The chief men refrained from speaking and covered their mouths with their hands. The voices of the nobles were hushed, and their tongues stuck to the roof of their mouths. Whoever heard me speak spoke well of me, and those who saw me commended me. Wow. There's a difference between guys and girls. I don't know if you've ever realized this or not. Despite what our political society tells us, guys and girls have differences. And one of the big differences between guys and girls is if you look at what girls desire most, the thing they really desire in life, oftentimes is love. What guys desire most, you'd think it would be love too, right? Unfortunately, no. What guys tend to desire, it's not what you're thinking. Okay? It's respect. Guys, get off on respect. If we're not respected by our family, by our wives, by our friends, etc., we kind of die inside a little bit, because respect is huge with guys. And so what Job is turning to here is this disrespect that he's got from everybody. He said, back then, I was respected. Back then, people looked up to me. The old men were quiet. The nobles, I was respected. And for him, that's where he finds his comfort. But we also sometimes seek comfort by remembering other things. Like, for instance, our own acts of righteousness. Look at Job 29, 12 through 17. He says, because I rescued the poor who cried for help, and the fatherless who had none to assist them. The one who was dying blessed me. I made the widow's heart sing. I put on righteousness as my clothing. Justice was my robe and my turban. I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy. I took up the case of the stranger. I broke the fangs of the wicked and snatched the victims from their teeth. Flowery words. But Job is looking at his acts of righteousness. He's looking at the things he did, and he takes comfort in those. Do you take comfort in the good things you've done in life? Do you sometimes look back when life is getting hard, and in your brain you go back to the things like, this may be happening to me, but I'm a really good person. These are the good things I've done. We like to pat ourselves on our backs. We like to build ourselves up. And in his defense, Job is constructing in his brain, he's going back to past comforts and things that made his life somehow, at least made him feel better. We can feel oftentimes justified in what we believe should have happened to us because of how good we were being. We look back and we say, well, really, this stuff that's happened to me shouldn't happen to me because I'm a good guy. But sometimes, when we look back at those good things, it's because we don't really know much different. Had Job ever struggled in the past? We're not told if he did. Success seems to have defined his life. And so, because of this, because of all these good things that have happened to him, he in many ways expects them to last forever. Look at Job 29, 18 through 20. He says, I thought I will die in my own house. My days as numerous as the grains of sand. My roots will reach to the water, and the dew will lie all night on my branches. My glory will not fade. The bow will ever be new in my hand. He's looking at his life, and he's thinking, this is what it should have been. I should always have had this. And so he's looking back in his past. He's taking comfort from that. The reality, though, for most of us, is that life is not just peaches and cream. Or am I the only one in here? Do you guys ever have ups and downs in your lives? Or is it all ups for you? Klein, is it all up? Absolutely, all up. Now, life is full of ups and downs. We have times when we're laughing, or times we're crying. Times we're happy, or times we're sad. There are times where everything is great, and then it's almost like we're licking the bottom of a trash can. It's terrible what's going on in our lives. To cope, we often live in the past. But when that fails, our next defense is to lash out at our present circumstances. We haven't been able to find that enough comfort living in the past, so we lash out at the present. Those of you who may have seen me when I'm not wearing my church clothes, you'll notice that oftentimes I wear like Snoopy shirts. Because my family buys me Snoopy shirts because they know how much I love Peanuts and all things like that. Linus is my favorite character.
Yeah, what about Linus shirts?
Linus, absolutely. Linus, with the thumb sucking in the blanket and all this kind of stuff. I mean, I love this kind of stuff. Linus is my favorite character. But you don't see many Linus shirts, and so it's all Snoopy shirts. And Snoopy's great. But something that I've noticed about the Snoopy shirts, I was just thinking about it the other day. All of my Snoopy shirts, while funny, and I get comments on it and everything else, all of them really have a couple of themes. Either grumbling about what's going on, or avoidance of things they don't want to face. It's always grumbling or avoidance. We love the positive if it comes easy, right?
Yes.
But if it doesn't come easy, we're going to default to the negative. We thrive on the negative. We talk about how unfair life is. We talk about how, if it was only a little bit better, if it was only a little bit cooler today. Or if it's too cool, it's a little bit hotter today. And it really comes down even into what we watch on television or on the computers. I mean, if we look at the news, it's all negative, right? Or if we play video games, very few of us would play computer games or phones on our day. We're just all happy and, no, we're out there killing somebody, doing something really blowing things up, fighting. Not planting flowers. Imagine a game that's all planting flowers. There's a few out there. Not many. Or we're watching shows with lots of drama, right? Lots of action and suspense, and things are going to go wrong, and somebody got killed, and we've got to stop. Why do we focus on the negative? Why does the negative appeal to us? Why?
Because there's positive that can come from the negative.
There's positive that can come from the negative, but we tend to dwell more on the negative. Yes, but there is positive. Yes, we're looking for that gleam of light. You're absolutely right. But we do spend our time focusing on the negative. We talk about each other sometimes. We gossip. We don't start, he's such a nice person, she's such a nice person. No, we badmouth people. And we feel good about that. And that shouldn't be. Ironically, as Peter was talking about, negativity can sometimes help us feel better because we are looking for that positive. We're figuring there's going to be some positive at the end, right? And negativity ends up sort of helping us feel better about ourselves, but unfortunately it keeps us focused oftentimes on the bad rather than the good. Rather than looking for God in the darkness, we focus on the darkness of our present circumstances. And Job is no exception. Job 30, 1 through 10. He says, "But now they mock me." This was all good. But now they mock me. Men younger than I, whose fathers I would have disdained to put with my sheepdogs. Now that's a terrible statement, right? I wouldn't want to put their fathers with my sheepdogs. Well, Job is being kind of tough here. Of what use was the strength of their hands to me, since their vigor had gone from them? Haggard from want and hunger, they roamed the parched land and desolate wastelands at night. In the brush they gathered salt herbs, and their food was the root of the broom bush. They were banished from human society, shouted at, as if they were thieves. They were forced to live in the dry stream beds among the rocks and in holes in the ground. They brayed among the bushes and huddled in the undergrowth. A base and nameless brood. They were driven out of the land. Notice contrast there. It says, but now, those young men mock me in song. I've become a byword among them. They detest me and keep their distance. They do not hesitate to spit in my face. These were the ones that we looked down on, and now they look down on me. Job is like, this is not fair. I was up here, and now I'm at the very bottom. Job has lost the respect of others and is killing them. And in his despair, he only sees the negative. Job 30, 15 through 17. Terrors overwhelm me. My dignity is driven away as by the wind. My safety vanishes like a cloud. And now my life ebbs away. Days of suffering grip me. Night pierces my bones. My gnawing pains never rest. You look at Job, and you look at him as his complaining and his agony and all of this. But I'm not blaming him. I'm not blaming him because I have to ask, would I react any differently? Am I somehow better than Job? Are you? If you were going through the problems that Job is going through, would you react differently? The thing is, we can look in hindsight, we can look at Job's life, and we can say, well, you should have looked for the hope in the darkness. But the problem is when the darkness is so overwhelming sometimes, it is really, really hard to see any hope at all. And all we do is build our defenses. We live in the past comforts. And we lash out at our present circumstances. Job is, in his pain, he's blind to the deeper reality that God will soon reveal in his life. But instead he lashes out. And while never accusing God of wrongdoing, he still kind of goes along that line because he still blames God for his problems. Look at his words in Job 30, 20 through 23. He says, I cry out to you, God, but you do not answer. I stand up, but you merely look at me. You turn on me ruthlessly. With the might of your hand, you attack me. You snatch me up and drive me before the wind. You toss me about in the storm. I know you'll bring me down to death, to the place appointed for all the living. Do you ever feel like that? Do you ever feel that God's against you? Do you feel like you're praying and your prayers are hitting the ceiling and bouncing around like a ping pong ball, but they're never reaching God? And you're saying, God, just show me why. What's going on? I'm sorry for whatever I did. And it's like God's not answering. That's where Job is. Job is at that point in his life, and he's like, God, where are you? Why are you doing this to me? Why are you letting this happen to me? I think all of us can relate at times. So in these times when we are living, going through tragedy, we make these defenses. We live in our past comforts. We lash out at our present circumstances. And sometimes we have one more defense we throw up. We seek to justify our actions. And you have to admit, we're all at fault of this. We all try to come across as like, this can't be my fault. I mean, everything that's happening can't be me. Even if we're not really to blame. as we've talked about, so sometimes it's not our sin, it's just a sinful world. Even then we seem to try to justify ourselves because we want to, make sure that everyone knows it's not us. Job falls into this trap too. Job 31, 16 through 23. He says, if I denied the desires of the poor, or let the eyes of the widow grow weary, if I have kept my bread to myself, not sharing it with the fatherless, but from my youth I reared them as a father would, and from my birth I guided the widow. If I have seen anyone perishing for lack of clothing, or the needy without garments, and their hearts did not bless me for warming them with the fleece from my sheep, if I have raised my hand against the fatherless, knowing that I had influence in court, then let my arm fall from the shoulder, let it be broken off at the joint. For I dreaded destruction from God, and for fear of his splendor, I did not do such things. Job is saying, look, I'm righteous here. I'm righteous. I did all these wonderful things. There's no way that I'm at blame here. And I really don't understand why I'm being punished. This entire chapter, by the way, chapter 31, is one long exaggeration of how wonderful a person Job is. I just love this one about birth in verse 18, though. He says, from my birth I guided the widow. Really? Really, Job? From your birth you guided the widow. A little bit of exaggeration. But we all do. We all try to justify ourselves. And we all do the things we've talked about today in our defense. But here's the thing. When you're in the darkness, all of that defensiveness doesn't work. It's natural to try it, but it doesn't work. The only thing that's going to get you out of this darkness is to seek the light at the end of the tunnel. And when you can't see that light, you need to cling to God. And even when you do see the light, you need to cling to God. We need to cling to God in the darkness. In the dark, we can't always see God. We can't see the good. We can't see the light. So what do? If you can't see the light at the tunnel, if you can't even see in front of you, you can't see God. You can still reach out. And you cling to what you know. You cling to his promises. You cling to his word. You cling to the hope he provides, even if you can't feel it. I counsel a lot of people. One of the things that comes up sometimes in counseling is people are praying and they're saying, I can't see God. I can't feel God. I pray and it's like he's not there. The thing is, God is always there. He's always there for us to cling to. And when we can't see his face directly, we can cling to his word and his promises, and what he provides for us. We need to make James 4, 7 through 10 our heart's assurance. It says, submit yourselves then to God. Resist the devil, and he'll flee from you. Come near to God, and he'll come near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Grieve, mourn, and wail, and change your laughter to mourning, and your joy to gloom. And then you can find strength, even in the despair. George Mueller, one of possibly the greatest prayer warriors ever. We've talked about it before, where He never asked anybody for money. And yet God, opened the floodgates of money for him to be able not to live wealthily. He never did that, or his family, but instead to provide homes for orphans. And he opened several homes and provided for their food and everything else, and God just continued to pour it out. But one day, February 6, 1870, George Mueller's wife died. And it was devastating. Devastating. But on February 11th, he wrote in his journal, he said, "Today the earthly remains of my precious wife are laid in the grave. Many thousands of persons showed the deepest sympathy, and about 1,400 of the orphans who were able to walk followed in the procession, and I myself, sustained by the Lord to the utmost, performed the service at the chapel, in the cemetery, etc." For his funeral service, he chose Psalm 119:68, and he had 3 points. He said, first of all, the Lord was good and did good at giving her to me. The second point he made was the Lord was good and did good in so long leaving her to me. And the third point was the Lord was good and did good in taking her from me. And explaining that last point, he was talking about the fact that even though for him personally it was a tragedy, it was all about God's will. And this is what he wrote. He says, "Every day I see more and more how great is your loss to the orphans. Yet without an effort, my inmost soul habitually joys in the joy of that loved departed one. Her happiness gives joy to me. My dear daughter and I would not have her back were it possible to produce it by the turn of the hand. God himself has done it. We are satisfied with him. As a husband, I feel more and more every day that I'm without this pleasant, useful, loving companion. As the director of the orphan houses, I miss her in numberless ways, and shall miss her yet more and more. But as a child of God, and as the servant of the Lord Jesus, I bow. I'm satisfied with the will of my Heavenly Father. I seek by perfect submission to his holy will to glorify him. I kiss continually the hand that has afflicted me, but I also say, I shall meet her again and spend a happy eternity with her." He could see that even in this utter tragedy, God was God. He might not have been able to understand it all, but he was willing to trust that his God had all the answers. Can you thank God in the tragedy? When the darkness comes, when the death of a family member comes, when the death of your dreams come, and you don't understand, can you still thank God? Can you still thank God for what he's doing, even though you don't get it? See, that's where we need to be. We need to be able to cling to God in the darkness and trust. And say, Lord, I don't understand what's going on. But I'm going to tear down my defenses because they're useless. And instead, I'm just going to embrace you. I'm going to trust you in this helplessness. We're coming to a time of communion, a time when we can get our hearts right, hopefully, with God. Maybe you've been going through some dark times. And maybe that you're out of the darkness now, but you look back in the darkness that you went through, and you're like, really, I didn't put God first in that time. I railed out against God, but I never really clung to Him. And this is a time that you can get that, your heart's right with God. Confess that. And ask that as you go forward, that no matter what, you will trust Him.